Today we're going to be talking about how to aim for the ideal exegetical idea. And this is part 7 of our series on the exegetical idea. Now, as we're going into this, I use the term ideal because usually you hear this distinction, the real and the ideal. Real, a lot of times people use it in the sense of the real world, the reality of things. Ideal is the goal or the aim that you're trying to reach. And we've approached this concept of the exegetical idea, or this step, in from a very simplistic method, starting in the very beginning of the videos. Basically, we use the term descriptive summary because some people choke on the word exegetical idea, and then later on we defined what exegetical idea was. And we've used steps along the way that we could go and go in more detail right now, but I would probably lose a lot of the audience, and that's not my goal at this point. I can make more advanced videos on other playlists and things like that. But in the last video, what we did was we looked at how to find the exegetical idea by using action words. And basically, an exegetical idea, it does have to be able to follow the action of the passage and describe the Bible world. And but instead of going into a bunch of grammar and syntax and all of those things like that, I want to take a step back and talk about what the exegetical idea ideally is supposed to do. Okay. So let's say that the ideal exegetical idea is the perfect objective way that the passage is explained, and it's the message that God intended. In other words, if you can imagine that whenever you go to read the Bible, that you understood everything that God wanted you to understand, and nothing was lost. And yes, God is able to communicate to us in that way, but that depends on the illumination ministry of the Holy Spirit, as well as the yielding of yielding ourselves to His Spirit rather than the flesh, and also God's sovereign responsibility in our growth as well. So we all grow in different ways. But just imagine for a moment if you knew exactly what the passage was intended, the what it meant, and all that. And so that would be the ideal. Okay. Well, whenever you're dealing with this ideal, there's 6 gaps that have to be bridged. And you may find more gaps, but these are gaps that I've based off of previous studies that I've done that have been beneficial. So this exegetical idea will be an explanation of the biblical content in context, given the message that God intended. And so that's important for us to recognize, is that we're trying to do our best to get back to that message that God intended. And so there's certain gaps in interpretation that we have. We have a time gap, we have a geography gap, we have a cultural gap, we have a language gap, we have a literary gap, and of course a spiritual gap. Time gap is, what we're gonna do is we're gonna go through the different outlines that we're going to be doing. Even before I reveal how to do the other outlines, I want us to see kind of like a comparison of the different outlines. So for the exegetical idea and outline, or the descriptive summary, its focus is on the Bible world. It's whenever you're making an outline to teach or preach, this would deal with the concept of explanation. So the time gap for this is, what biblical age is our passage in? In other words, what's going on at that time? Geography gap, or are the events inside or outside the promised land? Now, these questions are not exhaustive. These are the ones that immediately came to my mind when I made this chart. A cultural gap. This is a simplistic one, but is it a Gentile or Jewish audience? Language gap. Is it Hebrew, Aramaic, or Greek, the original language? Literary gap. What type of genre is the writing considered as? And a spiritual gap. Is it a believer in the passage, or are they carnal, or are they mature? So you can look at that, and if we were just to run through an exegetical idea, this is telling me this, is that My exegetical idea must reflect the same time. It should be able to consider what's going on, where the people are placed in light of God's plan and program for the world, and in geography, what the makeup of the audience is, and then of course which original language am I unpacking, and then what type of genre, and then of course the spiritual dimension about the audience. So that's a lot of information. And what we'll probably do is we'll probably use these questions maybe to refine our exegetical idea. I may do that in the next video just so we can see how that all works out, if any. So the next outline is the expositional idea and outline. And this is where you're drawing a principle summary. This is a bridge between the Bible world and the congregational or small group world. It focuses on the modern world, the timeless truth passages that are pretty much true throughout all time. The time gap here is what is timeless and true concerning God's character and his self-revelation. Geography gap is not so much important here because we're dealing with timeless truth principles. The culture gap is what is culturally bound and what is transcultural. In other words, what was limited for that particular culture or that particular person, and what is not limited. The language gap is not so much important here because you're bringing it over into the English. The literary gap, how does the genre that you're studying express timeless truth principles? The spiritual gap, what is the condition of the world and the worldly? In other words, what's going on in the world, but at the same time, in the worldly person, how does the worldly person think? Because some Christians think worldly. Now, going over to the teaching or preaching idea or outline, this focuses on your congregation or your small group world. And so where the bridge kind of helps with illustrations, you start thinking about illustrations that would highlight these principles. The teaching and preaching outline focuses more on application. So when we're dealing with this time gap, it's 2,000 years later after the Bible has been completed. So what has changed? That's the questions you ask. What are the similarities and differences? Geography-wise, you could say, are my people rural or urban? In other words, do they live in a country? Do they live in a city? How can I use those illustrations and explain what's in the text in a way where they can understand me? A cultural gap. Are my people secular or do they believe in the supernatural? Of course, if you got people that doubt the supernatural, that's going to affect how you draw your principles as well as apply them. Language gap. What clarifications do I need to make for them? Like differences in languages, both in the original language or even in English, in different terms. Literary gap. What similarities and differences are known in the genres? Making comparison to current examples of genres today. And the spiritual gap. Are they saved? Are they maturing? So we can see from this right here that there's a lot involved in studying the Bible. And typically Bible studies in church and in small groups, they tend to skip this. And because they skip this, their principles are wrong. And so their application ends up being wrong. Or sometimes you can have the right application but the wrong passage. And so hopefully this gives you an idea about how to get to an ideal exegetical idea. Like I said, it shows the exegetical idea and outline in relation to the other outlines, but it would still help prepare us for getting an idea for the ideal. So if this was beneficial to you, please subscribe if you haven't already. Hit the bell so that you can receive notifications. Share this with others and let us know what you think so that we can continue to improve. God bless.